Welcome, everybody. My name is Francisco Monaldi. I am the fellow in Latin American Energy Policy here at the Baker Institute. And on behalf of the Center for the United States and Mexico and the Center for Energy Studies at the Baker Institute, I welcome you to this very interesting webinar and very timely, in which we will be examining the new environment for renewables in renewable energy in Mexico. This is a difficult time for the energy industry in Mexico. Spoiler alert, after the election of President López Obrador, there have been some significant setbacks to the energy reform. And it may be surprising to some of us that a leftist government has been so antagonistic, in particular to the renewables industry, although not as surprising that it has been antagonistic to foreign direct investment, which is more traditional for the left in Latin America. I think in the case of President López Obrador, there is also the factor that he was raised as in an oil-producing state and has a very traditional resource nationalist view that gives fossil fuels a prominent role in the development of the country, and is sort of suspicious of the energy transition as something that is sort of imposed by the countries to the north. And also, of course, there is this notion of importance of state-owned enterprises on the strategic sectors like energy, that makes it harder for him to accept the realities of the energy transition. So today we have a very interesting panel of experts. I will only be introducing the event, and I will hand it in a couple of minutes to our moderator, who will be Rebecca Bollenbach. Rebecca is one of the founding partners of Essentia Advisory Partners, an energy consulting firm headquartered in Houston. She leads the firm's power and natural gas consulting practice in Mexico. In her almost 20 years of experience in the deregulated power and gas, she has worked closely with a range of clients across different markets in the US, Canada, and more recently with the deregulation of the sector in Mexico. She splits her time between the US and Mexico these days. And of course, is in close contact with the Secretary of Energy, with the Regulatory Energy Commission of Mexico, SENACE, and other entities that are sort of managing the energy policy regarding the electricity sector in the new deregulated market in Mexico. Rebecca's team is retained by the Western Power Trading Forum as their Mexico energy regulatory advisor, and she also serves as the executive secretary of the Asociación de Comercializadores de Energía in Mexico City. So we have a great moderator, and of course she also will offer her views, and she will introduce the other two panelists, Lourdes Melgar and Eduardo Márquez Letucha. So with that, I hand it to you, Rebecca. Thank you.
Thank you, Francisco. I'm Rebecca from Essentia. I'm very excited to take part in this conversation, another great event put together by Tony's team there at the Baker Institute. And as Francisco said, it's very timely because as many of you know, for those who are not fans of the Mañanera these days, or glue yourself to El Financiero, the landscape has changed so much since the deregulation got kicked off with the constitutional changes in 2013. If we look back at where renewables were in the years from 2016 to 2018, with things like the long-term auction garnering $9 billion of investment, 7,000 new megawatts of investment, things were, even though we knew the market had its own issues, I feel like the market participants knew we were making progress with the CRE, with SENACE in terms of working out how to keep expanding renewables. The cell market was very strong at that time. And I want to say it's not, it's less, but it's still pretty okay. Post-election, we're going to talk with our experts about the challenges that renewables are facing and maybe some potential solutions. But I'd like to kind of hit 3 points because unfortunately the renewables have been hit by sort of this triple challenge since the end of 2018 when the new administration came in. And that one, the first and the foremost that most folks are aware of is the new administration and what their policies have been, particularly at the beginning of 2019, after the handover on December 1st of 2018, we saw huge shifts in the staffing at the CRE, at SENACE, at SENER, and that's usually expected. But one of the really big impacts of that is it stopped all of the progress and the conversations that these developers were able to have within Mexico with our regulators. All of that froze, and it has remained relatively frozen, unfortunately. The shutdown of the SENACE farm and other impacts, aside from the regulation, that started the slide down of the regulatory conversations that we saw from 2019 going forward. Here in 2020, we've seen them actually starting to turn an eye away from the hydrocarbons and onto electricity with specific policies, and particularly with SENACE's ruling that they attempted back in the end of May, which then was transformed by SENER into an attempt at really a power grab without rolling back the reforms in the name of reliability, was to take control away from the market as a whole and hand it more to CFE in the name of reliability. That was particularly impacting our renewables because there were specific terms in there limiting interconnections, giving SENACE control to run any unit that they felt was necessary for reliability. So that, especially in the end of 2020, we have seen regulatory issues that are very, very deeply concerning for renewables in particular. But there's two other things that are impacting renewables that can't be forgotten. One of those is the physical transmission situation we have in Mexico. So aside from this claim that SENER has made that reliability is important, this is not a pretext. There are significant transmission issues that we have today, particularly in the Northwest, as an example, that are justifiably, without some improvements, going to keep placing our renewable resources at risk in those areas of the market for curtailment, because this transmission system that we have in Mexico has been underinvested in for, you could say years, you might even say a couple of decades by CFE. There are significant transmission improvements. Unfortunately, we don't see those improvements on the table with the current administration. They want to focus more on physical generation assets, not transmission. So our renewables do have a transmission issue. This third piece of this is we have economic changes that have gone on, not just because of COVID, but in these economic plans that our renewable resources down there have made in terms of their financing and what the anticipated revenue is. We've seen a 70% drop in the spot market prices in Mexico since, let's call it June of last year, okay? We have seen those prices decline dramatically. So what is it? Cheap gas. We have very cheap fuel oil from Pemex that is now being used in the place of some of these resources on a must-run basis. And there have been significant additions, not just renewable, but thermal, to the grid itself. We've added over 7,500 megawatts of new generation just in the last, call it 12 to 14 months. So these economic plans where we thought renewables would be getting $40 or $50 or $60 per USD for their energy, now in some of those areas they're getting $15, which really impacts the economics of the project. So with those three challenges, I'd like to hand it over to our first panelist, and that is Lourdes Melgar. So Dr. Lourdes Melgar Palacios, she's a non-resident fellow at the Baker Institute right now. Most of us in the market know her better for her terrific work at SENER. She was the Deputy Secretary for Energy for Hydrocarbons. And then prior to that, she was the actual Undersecretary of Electricity. So quite a lot of expertise in this area. And with that, I'll hand it over for some comments by Dr. Lourdes.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the Baker Institute for inviting me to participate in this very timely panel. And I prepare a couple of slides that I would like to share with you because I think it's important to understand sort of what the background is and what's actually happening in Mexico in terms of the energy sector and the implications that this is having in the renewable side of things before we can actually go into figuring out what options are available to all of us. So let me try to share the slides. Okay. Let's see, share. Can you see them? I hope so. Okay, so I'm not going to go through the whole thing that I prepared. I'll give I'll send them to the Baker Institute the slides so you can follow them in greater detail if you want. But basically, what I would say is that what we're seeing right now in the energy sector, and particularly in the electricity sector, is a dispute for the energy sector with two very clear visions of where we should, how the sector should be organized. And here, President López Obrador has been very clear since the energy reform that it's not of his liking, even though he has a vow to respect the law until 2021. But basically, his view is one of energy sovereignty. And if you have a chance to look at the document that was published in the official Gazette de Diario Oficial de la Federación today, the sectorial program of energy is there. And what you can see is not only that we're aiming at energy sovereignty, but actually at producing all the energy that we consume here in Mexico. And at the heart of the whole thing is Pemex. And not only that, but more importantly, it's the idea that oil will be what will fuel the Mexican economy and Mexican development. And this has very important implications for CFE and for the energy sector as a whole, where the role of markets, as we had planned, of competitive markets, is no longer something that is aimed at. And this has had the implication, of course, of translating into actions. Rebecca already gave an overview of some of the things we have seen, but I wanted to go rapidly over what has happened over the past few months. First of all, when during the past year, what we saw was, first of all, that the clean energy auctions were canceled, first postponed during the transition period in 2018 and then canceled. We had the cancellation also of the transmission line bids, which was very important because, in particular, one of the transmission lines from Oaxaca to central Mexico is fundamental to be able to deliver renewable energies from wind energy. And then we go to what has happened over COVID. So in Mexico, the lockdown started around March, the third week of March. And in the midst of all of this, the energy sector, either SENACE or SENER, had issued, or the CRE have issued 3 decrees that are fundamental in terms of the deployment of renewable energies. The first one, which very clearly was aimed at renewables, was the one issued by SENACE on April 29th of this year, because basically what it said is that it would block the entrance of new renewable projects to the grid. And what is really difficult about this is that we're talking of projects, some of them were already doing tests and delivering to the grid. These projects were built under the auctions that the government organized in the prior administration. And basically the investments are already there. and they're being canceled. I mean, what is being canceled is the ability to deliver the energy. And so this, of course, has affected many projects in primarily in the wind and solar sector. And of course, there has been legal action taken to try to revert this policy. But then, as you know, as companies were winning the amparos on the legal side, Sener came out with a decree, which most people have read it as blocking renewable energies. But I would pose that this decree goes far along in terms of blocking the deployment of any energy produced by the private sector. And why do I claim that? Well, basically because what it does is that it puts upside down the electricity market, putting reliability ahead of economic dispatch and providing discretionality to the SENACE, which is the ISO, in terms of favoring the dispatch first of CFE plants. And this affects not only renewable energies, but also combined cycles. And it also has written in there issues related to distributed generation, which bring into question whether or not distributed generation is something that will be allowed as it has been under the current administration. And finally, what we saw is on June 10th, the CRE enacting an increase on transmission and distribution rights rates that go from 400% to 700% in some cases. Now, behind all of this, the government has made two clear arguments. One has to do with the reliability and the availability of being able to deploy renewables at a time where demand has contracted. And the other one is that the president has claimed that there is corruption behind all these contracts. So I think it's very important to be able to analyze where the issues are. And in order to understand where they're coming from, I wanted to go over basically what was the organization of the electricity sector prior to the reform and after the reform, so that we can understand where the issues are. So this graph that you see is basically how the electricity sector was organized between 1992 and 2013, when the constitutional reform was approved. And what you can see is that basically you have public service where CFE dispatches to households and to commercial users. And you have what is called CFEPS, which is the IPPs. Basically, CFE didn't have enough money to invest in generation, and they started establishing IPP frameworks to buy electricity from private producers. And basically, these private producers produce for CFE. There have been bidding processes to select who was going to produce, and they have contracts with CFE. Some of the contracts are being called into question, and some of the contracts where the increase in the rates of transmission and distribution are precisely these contracts that come from legal reform that took place prior to the energy reform of 2013. Then we had, under the 1992 opening, different elements of self-supply where basically Pemex could produce for itself, and then you could produce self-supply renewable energies for commercial or industrial use, such as Walmart, or big consuming companies such as steel plants or cement plants, etc. This is important because precisely at this niche is where renewable energies started to develop in Mexico. And I'm talking of issues that happened in the late 1990s, but mostly in the Calderon era of 2006 to 2012. So these are part of the contracts that are being under attack because they're seen as being subsidized by the government. During the design of the energy reform, there was a lot of discussion about what to do with these contracts. But the thing is, they already have rights. They have acquired rights that needed to be respected. And there was a phase out process. And this is what they are generalizing as happening in the entire renewable sector. And it's not true. It only applies to specific projects of self-supply. So what did the reform do? And this is the other thing that I think is very important, because there is a lot of confusion. Basically, what the reform did is, what you can see on the right side is it opened up to competition, retail, generation, and the retail of electricity. So generation, you can have, it's open, you can have CFE or you can have private participants, but transmission and distributions is in the hand of the state. So that's in the hands of CFE. And the control of the spot market and the dispatch is in the hands of the state, also in SENACE. And subsidies are only applied to domestic consumers, residential consumers, and it's only clients of CFE that can have subsidies. So this is important because there is a competitive market where most of the control is in the hands of the state, and where most of the generation is also in the hands of CFE. And private participants are either generating with combined cycles or growing numbers with renewable energies, mostly wind and solar. So I think it's important to see where we're at, because most of the new contracts were issued through these competitive bidding processes, the auctions, the clean energy auctions, that were very transparent and that provided very low prices of electricity. And of course, they are very competitive vis-a-vis CFE. Even IPPs are very competitive vis-a-vis CFE. So what we're seeing right now is a big legal battle. And it's important because the president had committed not to change the law before the 2021 elections that we have, where he's going to try to have a constitutional majority and then be able to change the constitution. But what we have seen is, of course, companies going to courts, but we have also seen NGOs, like, for instance, Greenpeace going to different environmental groups going to the courts on the basis of the fact that what is going to be favored is the dispatch of fuel, oil, and coal, and that has an impact on the health of people, in addition to the economic burden that increased rates of electricity will imply. But more importantly, the COFECE, which is the Antitrust Commission, presented a constitutional dispute, which went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court has already granted a stay on this, on the implementation of the Senate decree, until the court revises the entire issue and can make a decision on it. And I think this is very important because, first of all, what we're seeing is a battle over democratic principles. You cannot legislate through Secretary Ministry's decree. That's the first thing. Second, one of the issues about the energy reform is that it had to agree with different other laws. So, for instance, with or constitutional principles, such as the laws of competition, climate change law, as health law. So there are different things that are being affected in addition to just the energy sector, and more, in terms of what we're discussing today, in terms of the electricity market, it is affecting clean energies. It is putting also at risk all the advancement that Mexico has had in terms of natural gas. I already mentioned issues related to distributed generation and smart grids, but I would argue also that it puts at risk government finances. The president has stressed that he's trying to save CFE, but if we look at the finances of CFE, CFE was doing much better in 2017 than it is doing right now. And if CFE is going to be forced again, which is all likely from what we're seeing, to consume the fuel oil that Pemex producing in its refining process and has no market right now, then the finances of CFE are going to hurt a lot. And of course, this decision is also putting at risk issues related to all the good implications of renewables in terms of job generation, local content development, benefits for the communities. And I would say, just to finish that, trying to go back to the past and trying to convince this administration that they should embrace the energy reform is not going to work. I mean, they have not been willing to hear the first thing of that. So we need to be very creative in terms of finding alternative paths to deploy renewables, where we put people and community at the center, benefits for people and community at the center. I think there is a lot of to talk about, but I thought it was important to put this as a background, this information as a background. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lourdes. I'm going to take it from here. So thank you very much for this background. For all of you who don't know me, my name is Eduardo Marquez, and I'm an associate at Sidley Austin, which is a law firm based here in, international law firm. I'm based in Houston. We have offices all over the US and some other countries. I think Lourdes touched very important points, some of which I'm going to make a little bit more emphasis. The first thing that I wanted to get out there first was to make clear that in Mexico, as well as in any other part in the world, intermittent energy, it is less reliable than conventional energy. Now, if we would have, for example, large-scale storage facilities, then part of the problem would be solved, but we don't. So it is well within the Ministry of Energy or the SENACE to update policies or to update the rules of the wholesale market, the Mercado Eléctrico Mayorista. The issue here, like Lourdes said, is that there seems to be a different agenda that doesn't go side by side with the actual development of the wholesale market and the principles in which the wholesale market was built on. Mainly, the new policy contradicts the principles of open access, non-discrimination treatment, and like Lourdes said, economic dispatch, which we're going to talk a little bit later on. Essentially, what the SENER and the SENER reliability policy and the SENACE resolution do is that they implement or they create new ancillary services that solar and wind power plants are going to have to purchase in order to offset their intermittency or their lack of reliability, for example, voltage control or balancing. So what the government is trying to do is to pass some of the costs that the conventional power plants, primarily owned by the government, have to incur in order for the solar and power plants to become more reliable. Now, again, this is something that in the big picture, any other country in the world is going through, in the sense that you have to have certain base load, which is powered by the conventional power, and then you have to let the clean energy participate on the grid with certain regulations in that side. Now, like Lourdes said, you know, we have, I think it's, we have the SENACE resolution, we have the SENER reliability policy, and we have the recent resolution by CRE increasing the tariff for transmission fees on the self-supply projects. So we know that private parties have filed amparos and have won the preliminary and permanent injunctions, which means that once the court will resolve in, you know, maybe the next 6 months or 1 year on the merits and the substance of the matters. Like Lourdes said, more importantly, we saw the COFECE acting independently, filing a constitutional claim, the Controversia Constitucional. And the COFECE argued that the SENER reliability policy was against open access, against the anti-discriminatory principles, and against economic dispatch. And if you look at the rules of the Mexican wholesale market, Mexico functions through, or the wholesale market functions through a principle that is called security constrained economic dispatch, which it is basically an optimization process to meet electricity demand at the lowest cost. And what this principle is trying to do, and why this was embedded in the rules, is really intended to systematically increase the use of the most efficient generation units. And obviously the new reliability policy doesn't achieve that because the government is trying to impose how to assign economic dispatch. So we're not doing what we call merit-based dispatch, or they're not trying to do merit-based dispatch. Another important thing on the effects that these resolutions had was we also saw municipalities and even states like the state of Tamaulipas filing claims, constitutional claims, or amparos also against the government resolutions. And on the international, in the international world, we also saw on the news that representatives from the embassies of the United States and Canada also raised their concerns about this. And most recently, even President Trudeau mentioned, that they wanted to talk about the investment and renewable energy on his recent call with President AMLO. And we know that because he published that on Justin Trudeau's press release on Monday about the things they discussed with AMLO. Now, that being said, I think there's a spillover effect on investment and the way that the new projects are going to be, or new and existing projects are going to have to coexist with the new renewable energy policy and the new environment. We can say that there's really three types of projects that are, we can put them in three buckets: development projects, projects under construction, and projects that are already in operation. So development projects are those projects that are usually developed by smaller companies where they try to get the land contracts, and they try to get, if they can, the interconnection, or if they have to, they post the initial guarantees. These small development projects, what they do is they try to sell it to another group of sponsors that will later get the finance for the project. For these development sponsors, it is going to be difficult with the regulatory uncertainty to actually close on their sales. And we've seen some development projects having some of these difficulties. Why? Because there's just a lot of uncertainty around them. We also have the projects under construction, which will probably have most of the effects on the legal side on their contracts. And it really depends on the language on the contract they have, but usually the projects under construction already have financing in place. They're building the power plant, they're building the solar or wind farms. But to do that, they have to get money from the lenders each time they meet a milestone, etc. And depending on the contracts, they probably will have to bring down their reps and warranties, which means that they have to represent that certain things are still true and correct exactly as they were at the time they enter into the contract. For example, it wouldn't be unusual to see a change in law clause or a material adverse effect clause. So if these changes raise to the level of a material adverse effect or a change in law, then the borrowers will not be able to borrow money and to rep that this is still true and correct. So they're going to have to sit with the lenders and figure out what to do. And of course, this also puts the lenders in a difficult position because they want the project to be successful. They also want to get paid back. And the third bucket is our operating project. This type of projects, I think where they're going to see some of the issues is if the new ancillary services or the new tariffs for the self-supply, if they affect them substantially, then they're going to have to revise their financial models. And if it affects them very hard and they're not able to meet their financial obligations with their banks, then, same thing, they're going to have to sit with the banks. And the bank will probably either request them to put more equity on the project, or they have to make pay downs on the loan, maybe stop dividends. So there's a lot of things that can happen in the actual documents. Now, what I think is the market outlook. I think maybe a lot of these projects were already on default or having difficulties due to COVID. Now, you add this with the regulatory uncertainty, and I think what happens is really that Mexico's risk profile is changing, but although that's not ideal, it's also not something that sophisticated investors or sponsors or international lenders are not used to. So political risk is something that has always existed in project finance. So I think right now the issue is how to face these new challenges. Obviously, wait to see what the Supreme Court will resolve, wait to see how federal courts are dealing with the SENACE resolution, or how they are dealing with the circuit court, Tribunal Colegiado Circuito, that also reversed a decision on the CRE tariffs. And we'll see how the market responds. Now, just a couple of weeks ago, in the midst of all of this going on, the largest private power company in Mexico got financing from a US development bank. So things are still moving along. Where there is risk, there's a reward. And I think what is going to happen is that the government has to sit down with the relevant parties. They probably should have done that before surprising everyone with these resolutions. But we're going to have to do a sit down, and market players are going to have to, like Lourdes said, we're going to have to propose solutions to find a middle ground on how to better improve the market while addressing the new concerns by the government. With that, I think that's enough time of me. So I'm going to pass it on to Rebecca. And Rebecca, I leave it to you.
Thank you, Eduardo. Very, wouldn't say much good news, but definitely I would, we've got a few questions and answers to come to. I just wanted to add a quick comment as well on what Lourdes said about Pemex being at the heart of this all. I completely agree. And also agree with, the need to open these conversations with a lot of our regulators to really exhibit reasons why some of these changes, to be honest, that were meant to benefit CFE are not benefiting CFE's finances. On a macro level, they appear to be good decisions, but tying CFE to the finances of Pemex, one sinking ship and you're going to sink the other ship along with it, is probably not the greatest idea with some of the policies. As a specific example, if we look at the investments that say that Energía, CF Energía, who's the gas supply division, the fuel supply division to all of the CFE generation companies, if we look at the amount of investment that they have recently made in these pipelines, if they replace those fuel supplies with Pemex fuel oil, cheap or not cheap, all of that investment goes to waste because there's not another home for that capacity beyond. There's some industrial use, but the majority of those users are going to be the EPSs. So with that said, we've got a couple of questions. I'm going to start with one from Ivan. He's actually posed a couple of questions for both Lourdes and Eduardo. The first is, the importance of a free market is transmission and distribution. Before AMLO, I think we're referring to post-2013, the state with the government, which still creates a monopoly. Why not auction it and regulate it? And I'm not sure if Eduardo or Lourdes wanted to comment on that. My own comment on the possibility to auction and that the approach that we had hoped to see taken on transmission was in fact to get foreign investment to participate in those as an investor and an eventual owner after a long-term lease to CFE, which was was canceled as one of the first things canceled after Sener had their change out in administration.
Okay. I like to make two comments, if I may. The first one is actually referring to something that Eduardo said, which is the importance of having a dialogue between the government and the participants in the electricity market. or in general, the participants in the energy sector. And I think one of the things that has been very difficult with this administration is the unwillingness, particularly in the energy sector, to have conversations and have a dialogue with people and reach an agreement. And what we saw with the decree of Sener, which in that very specific case, it led to the presentation of the resignation by Cesar Hernandez Ochoa, who was the Undersecretary of Electricity that took the reform from the once the constitutional reform was approved on to its implementation, is the fact that by law there's supposed to be consultation, and the government decided to publish all these documents without consultation, and it's been very difficult to get to that point where there is a dialogue and building consensus. And that is why, in my mind, there is a very clear view of where they want to take the energy sector in general, in particular the electricity sector. So it is very puzzling, because it would seem almost as if they didn't understand what the main problem is, that they cancel the auction for the transmission lines, and that there is so much focus put on CFE investing in generation rather than the need to invest in transmission and distribution. By design, it was decided to keep the monopoly in transmission and distribution, but to give it flexibility in terms of all the different type of arrangements to finance the expansion. And basically, the government has decided not to do it that way. So it's a question that I think is very pertinent, but in terms of the reality of what is happening right now, and from what the secretary has said, the only solution to the grid issues are that the government be willing to invest. And at this point, I just don't see where the financing of it would come, especially when we're not seeing it as a priority from CFE. I don't know if I'm addressing the question, but that's what comes to my mind.
I agree, and unfortunately, one of the other comments that I have heard coming from inside of the folks involved directly in the regulatory process right now is that the considerations of the labor unions, the generation labor union, is very large and very powerful, and them placing their request forward to build new generation facilities with the power of their union behind them has been more powerful in this sense than the transmission labor union, who doesn't have quite as much political power. So unfortunately, I think some of the lack of investment, of commitment to investment could be that. We have another question here, a good one, and it says, in terms of the new TMEC implementation, do you see any improvements regarding Mexico's energy policy towards renewables?
For
TMEC, US, I think that's the US.
I think that's what, it's a very pertinent question, especially today, that President López Obrador is going to meet in Washington with President Trump precisely to celebrate the beginning of TMEC. I think it's going to be very interesting to see how this administration reconciles its very nationalistic, pro-monopoly energy policy, anti-private sector energy policy with all the free trade, all the agreements, the free trade agreements that we have. There are already issues with the ratification of the European treaty, which was just the renegotiation was just finalized because of all the attacks that, in particular, the president has had against Spanish companies that have invested heavily in Mexico's electricity sector. There are issues already within TPP. And I think there's going to be issues related to interpretation with regards to the provisions in the US-Canada-Mexico agreement. particularly if we focus only on the energy side of things. I think it's going to be interesting to see how other provisions are looked at that have to do more with issues of even anti-corruption, competition, those type of things, from which one can go back to look at what's happening in specifically markets such as this one.
Yeah, and I wanted to add to what Lourdes said, that, you know, the USMCA, the entry into force, is one of those things that will help improve Mexico's risk profile. And in addition, kind of to the specific question, the supply of power generation services is it is covered. It is a sector covered by the USMCA. Also, there are certain grandfather rights on the USMCA from NAFTA. So if you have a cause of action, so for example, if you were affected by the SENACE resolution, you know, there's private rights of action under the NAFTA and USMCA. Now, you have to differentiate also between what an investment treaty would allow you, or an investment chapter of an investment treaty will allow you to do as a private person, and what a country could also do under a free trade agreement. Now, there's a lot of conditions that have to be met. They are very political. So if for some reason the conditions are met and Canada and the US want to take action, it could happen. But, you know, on its face, maybe this is not as discriminatory or open access or violates the open access. So that remains to be seen. But I think the USMCA gives more certainty to investments. It is a good thing that it was updated, a good thing that it's entered now into force, and definitely, in a sense, offsets kind of like the regulatory uncertainty that we were talking about during this presentation.
If I may add one comment, I think it's important to see that the treaty covers, of course, the entire economy. And I think one of the issues that the government perhaps is not seeing is that the decisions it is taking in the electricity sector could affect the competitiveness of Mexico, just because electricity rates for industrial and commercial use could go up, and they would not have the flexibility of using subsidies to make them more competitive. So I think there could be an issue there that is not being fully understood by the energy sector and its implication for the rest of the Mexican economy.
Thank you. Quite a few questions coming in, so I'll apologize in advance if we don't get to them all. I'm trying to skip around, and some of them are similar to hit all the subjects. One of which is, what is the outlook for the potential private auctions? I'm happy to speak to that one. We have been involved as advisors in one of the larger ones, and unfortunately, I think the biggest issue that happened with the private auctions is not just regulatory, but the COVID pandemic really placed a big halt right at the point that there were two private auctions from private industry sort of going in parallel. I think one was taking the direction of more of being bespoke transactions with more of a transparent framework, so you can see who you're transacting with, and the other, which was the Bravos Energia auction, was really set up to look very much like the CFE auctions in the sense of with some additional products. Right at the time that the buy offers were set to be published, the pandemic happened, after which we saw a lot of regulatory uncertainty. And I think the dependency for the viability of the auctions will really sit with the generators. I think the load side is pretty committed, and they would very much like to see the auctions to go forward. I think that we could see very strong offers on the load side, but with generation, especially since some of those responses on the generator side to those auctions were going to be new development projects, the amount of regulatory uncertainty for the ability to interconnect right now is really hampering those going forward. If we get some additional regulatory certainty in terms of especially renewables being able to actually interconnect with thermals as well, I think they've got counterparties in those auctions. I think they could go forward by the end of the year if that interconnect process gets clarified from a regulatory standpoint. We have many other questions to go. One is, what do you think is happening with the cells requested to companies? What about other instruments for carbon pricing, such as a carbon market or a trade pilot program?
Well, I think that's, it could be interesting. And I think there are a lot of possibilities out there. But one of the things that we have seen is that the Ministry of the Environment has had a very different outlook on this type of instruments that some pilot projects are operating in terms of carbon trading, especially among between states. But it's the policy that was put in place is basically being reverted as well. And I think this is really key, because what we are seeing in the energy sector has to do with the delinking of with climate change policy, and we're seeing that climate change policy is not a priority for this administration. So I think it's a great question, and I think it's going to be very interesting to keep observing what happens at the state level with the kind of instruments that could be developed.
Yeah, I wanted to add that some of the proposed changes to the clean energy certificates were pretty much aimed to allow hydroelectrics to participate in this market. And by doing that, by increasing the amount of certificates that you are able to offer the market, well, this is economics 101, right? More supply and demand. So if there's more supply, well, then the prices go down. So that was also one of the issues that a lot of the other types of renewable energy said. And why? Obviously, because the government, like we know from AMLO's first Proyecto de Nación, they were going to put a lot of emphasis on the hydroelectric plants. So, like Rebecca said, and like Lourdes also said at some point, we have to find different alternatives and solutions to how to promote renewable energy. Here in the US, it's very common to have tax equity structures, which are structures of investment that allow you to claim certain production tax credits. And we don't have those type of structures in Mexico as we have in other parts of the world. So maybe exploring the ways that we can finance projects by giving investors a good return on their money, but also developing the renewable energy and the electricity network, that'll be the best thing. So yeah, I think that's it.
Thank you. Here's another interesting one. How will June's decree for CFE's dispatch versus private parties, how will June's decree favor CFE's dispatch versus private parties? Is it the same for combined cycles versus renewables? And are the measures in place already? My own first comment to that would be, taking the last question first, are the measures in place already? If we look at the actual dispatch behaviors that SENACE has been putting in place, even prior to this ruling, there were multiple must-run units that were being called back in December. If we remember, in January 1st, that is when the IMO law went into effect, that basically said that the Pemex fuel oil, the heavy fuel oil that Pemex is producing, was not going to have a global market, at least until technology catches up in terms of marine traffic to be able to process that oil. We have seen a lot of out-of-order merit dispatches by SENACE since December. That was even before this ruling took place. The ruling was almost a type of legitimization of it. Is it the same for CCGT and renewable? It really has more to do with which renewables should always be looked at in that must run, because their marginal cost is zero, so they go into the bid stack. It's really about how much of those, based on their generation location, are subject to curtailment. But legally speaking, are the measures already in place? No, because SENACE has been told to stand down by the courts in terms of, from a legal standpoint, implementing what was completely in the ruling, which included the dispatch of must-run units. I have no idea if that answered your question, but we have let me see, back up. I missed one up here. This is a very good one. What are your views on the future regulatory framework? Is there any hope for power generation projects coming from private non-government entities during the current administration? And is there any middle ground in this area?
I think there definitely is space. I think, like I said, I think the risk profile has changed, but that, I gave the example just 2 weeks ago, there was big hundreds of millions of dollars financing for solar projects. So investors are just going to have to know how to allocate the risk. Now, the Mexican market is very sexy, right? It's a new market. We have a lot to offer, even with the regulatory uncertainty. There are more mature markets where players, they don't have enough space or enough demand to create new pipelines, to create new transmission lines, to create new generation facilities. Mexico is a very interesting market for some of these players that they want to expand. And what they have to do is the same thing they do whenever they do investments in other countries where arguably the rule of law might be not as good as Mexico, or maybe kind of similar. So people that they do business in other countries in Central America or South America, people that do business in Africa, in Asia, even in some countries in Europe. So I think there's a space. There's obviously a lot of there's uncertainty on, you don't want to make a big investment and then the next day wake up and say you're never going to reach commercial operation. But what we're seeing here is, I think for the first time in the democratic life of Mexico, or not for the first time, but we're seeing more recently, we're seeing stronger institutions in the sense that we saw the COFECE give controversia constitucional. We're seeing states stand their ground. We're seeing the government also stand their ground. So I think all of these factors are part of the development of the democratic life of Mexico, which we've been living on for the last 15, 20 years. So I definitely think the market is not as mature as we would want to. I definitely think we could go faster and we could maybe have better rules and regulations, but I think this is what we have, and I think investors are going to work with it. So again, there's concrete examples of investments that are still going on, as well as investments that have died because of this. But it depends on what's your risk appetite, like in any other type of investment.
No, I would totally agree with that. We're still dealing with, this is the world's 13th largest economy in Mexico. And, at the end of the day, especially under the stress that the pandemic has put on both of the US and Mexico economies, Hacienda's coffers are not unlimited, and we're going to have to work together globally as investors, not just US and Mexico, but globally, to try to find ways to optimize and get our economies back where we need them to, and that includes the energy sector. Mr. Tony, do we have time for one more? I think we're almost right at 12. Okay, cool.
Yeah, I think maybe one more. Yeah, if it's quick, maybe two, but then yeah, we should start wrapping it up. Thank you.
Okay, until now, what could be some of the most interesting ideas for alternative paths? And I'm assuming this means alternative paths for working with the concept of strengthening CFE as well as allowing for investment.
Well, I think one of the issues that perhaps, that has been put on the table, but we have not seen concrete examples, but that could be something of interest to this administration is, for instance, the idea of having community wind parks or solar parks. So directly, not just business. I think one of the big issues that this administration has is against the fact that many of these projects are in the hands of the private sector. CFE, some people say, well, CFE should be generating electricity, renewable energy. Renewable, the definition of wind and solar is not something that is of the interest of CFE. It has never been, but it is in the interest of local communities of ejidos who have been wanting to figure out how they can benefit from these resources. And I think issues where we can see partnerships between private producers and social producers is something that will be very attractive to this administration. Also, something that will be very attractive is in terms of the benefits for the communities. And we have seen some very interesting things happening in other parts of the world, for instance, in Norway or in Canada, where, communities, especially indigenous communities, own a percentage of the project and they benefit directly from it. And these type of things that have not been really fully explored in Mexico. I mean, the conversation began when we were drafting the energy reform. The energy reform does have an important social component, but there is a lot of improvement could be made there. And I think if we can show that these projects, especially solar and renewable, solar and wind can have benefits for the local communities that go beyond the payment of the rent of the land. I think this is something that could build a bridge for a conversation with the administration. In addition to issues related to distributed generation, because I think sometimes there is still this view that CFE is the one that is going to solve the issues of electricity access for all. But in reality, many of the people in Mexico who still don't have access to electricity are in very far away locations, difficult to get with, and where you cannot get with the grid. So distributed generation and small microgrid projects are the answer. And those are things where we can think out of the box in terms of how to bring them out to finance them also. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. The last the isolated grid concept is definitely something that could provide a huge social service to the areas that don't have electricity service right now, as well as growing the renewable footprint. So I think we're 4 minutes over. I think, Tony, we're out of time, but I want to thank very much our panelists and Francisco and Tony and the Baker Institute team for having this discussion. I apologize for those that didn't have that we didn't get to your question, but I think you could feel free to provide those to Laura or Tony for some feedback. With that, I'll turn it over to Tony.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you everyone for attending this event. Thank you, Rebecca, for moderating this event. And of course, thank you, Lourdes Melgar and Eduardo Marquez Sertucho for participating in this. This is very enlightening, obviously something that is evolving and that we all need to understand. Apparently every week we have to review what's going on. So I thank you for your insights, and we'll see you next time. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.